right. So today I'm super excited because we have Dr. Mark Stern, who is joining us to talk all about evaluating environmental education programs based on the research that he has done and, studies that he's done with real programming. So I'm not going to talk for too long. I'm going to go ahead and just send it over to Dr. Stern to introduce himself.
Okay, cool. Thanks. It's nice to be with you all today. I recognize some familiar faces and some familiar names in the group. I'm a professor at Virginia Tech. I do a lot of different types of research. I'm a social scientist, but I'm in a natural resources department. So I study human behavior in a lot of different contexts, one of those being environmental education and also environmental interpretation. I'm going to be talking today about research that we've been conducting for the last couple decades on environmental education programs. And I'm going to be sharing with you the findings of actually two studies. It's really one study, but two field seasons um, of a really unprecedented type of study where we looked at hundreds of programs across the United States to determine what works best in environmental education programs. So this is kind of like a holy grail sort of question for us. And you can see there's a huge list of names on this first slide that you're all looking at. Like research like this is definitely a team project. I mean, it's a team sport, so to say. So my co-PI in this work is Bob Powell from Clemson, and there's tons of grad students and research associates who've all contributed to this. And we really started out with this question a long time ago, right? Like if we know environmental education can lead to all sorts of great outcomes, but how do you do it well? Like, what makes a difference between an environmental education program that's going to just knock it out of the park and change kids' lives versus a program that is just okay, or maybe not even that good? So we move to answer, let me see if I can get this to advance. Yes, this particular question. And we had to do it within a specific context, right? Because if we just looked at all environmental education programs, we'd be dealing with like community outreach, stuff at like informal programs at parks and museums. We decided that we were going to do this particular study on one of the most common types of environmental education there is in the United States, and that's single day field trips. So these are not overnight. This is like when a school group comes to a site, or someone like you guys might go to a school site and run an environmental education program for anywhere from like, let's say, an hour up to like 4 or 5. I think the longest one in our sample is about an 8-hour program. And what we knew from the literature, as I mentioned before, is like environmental education can do a lot of great things. There's been a lot of evaluations, but the challenge is evaluations of environmental education programs tend to evaluate a single program, right? So if I go in and I evaluate a single program, I can tell you like, hey, this program, it looks like it achieved these outcomes. But if I want to answer why or how it achieved those outcomes, that's really difficult to do. I mean, I could do qualitative work. I can ask the students. I can ask maybe the visiting school teacher. I can ask the instructor. I can come up with like a lot of hypotheses, but it's really hard to generate evidence about what actually made the difference in outcomes. Now, there's a lot of assumptions that we have in the environmental education field about that question. If you're familiar with the North American Association for Environmental Education, there's these great publications out there called Guidelines for Excellence. If you're not familiar, check them out. They have a lot of best practices in there, but all of those best practices are based on the consensus of practitioners, not on research. So they might do a survey with hundreds of people like you and me, and we tell them what we think works best, and that's what goes into those. Um, we've been thinking all along, God, it sure would be nice to get some empirical evidence to actually answer the question. Like we have these assumptions about what good practice is, but we don't really have the evidence behind it. So what we decided we needed to do, you'll see these bullet points here. I should explain them all. So I've already explained the first two. The second is when you see, the third is when you see evaluation programs, evaluation of environmental education programs. A lot of times each evaluation is so unique. They're like, this one's measuring social emotional learning outcomes. This one's measuring knowledge. This one's measuring attitudes. This one's measuring behavior. This one's measuring class climate. It's very difficult to determine what's causing what. So we don't really have a whole lot of experimental research. You could imagine if I really wanted to get at isolating an approach or a way to do it, I might design an experiment to say, all right, we're going to do it this way like 100 times and this way 100 times. And we'll see which one is better. That would be one way to get at this question. We could isolate a single approach and figure out what's better for the audiences we care about. Or we could do like field quasi-experimental research where we can compare pre-existing programs. We decided to get the best sense of the field, we should do that field experiment. So we decided we were going to go out and pull off a logistical miracle and do a big national study. So we decided in order to do this, first off, we had to decide we have to look across hundreds of programs and we have to measure consistent outcomes. If we want to figure out what leads to good outcomes, we have to first define what good outcomes are. All right. So I'm going to talk about that challenge in a minute. And then we got to look at all sorts of programs that are trying to get us to those outcomes and figure out which ones actually get us there. So in order to do that, we have to go out and observe all these programs and track exactly what each one is doing. And if we can do that, if we can track, okay, here's like of the 100 different ways you can do it, we're noting all these different ways, which ones tend to lead to better outcomes. All right, so I'm going to explain how we did that in a sec. But first, I mentioned this first challenge of like, how do you come up with outcomes? Like, oh, let's do this in chat. Yeah, let me go back because this, I don't want to like sully your answers to this too much, but like, if you were going to try and answer this question, we would go to conferences back when we started this like 10 years ago, and we'd ask this question, what outcomes should every single environmental education program anywhere be aspiring to achieve? Is there a consistent set of outcomes that no matter where you are, if you're doing environmental education, this is what you should be going for? When we asked that question, a lot of people looked at us like, you're crazy. My program is about like butterflies and their migration. And like their program is about energy saving and recycling. No, the answer is no. I'm going to tell you the answer is not no, but I want to get your opinions. Use the chat and tell me, what do you think? Are there cross-cutting outcomes across environmental education programs that actually make sense? Like if you're doing environmental education, at the very least, you should be trying to get this. So I'll give you like a minute or two. Let's see what y'all think. Okay, engagement is one. So expand on that, Meredith, if you're willing. Like, what do you mean by engagement? Is it just that like they do stuff while you have them, or is there some engagement after the program you're looking for? Okay, try to be hands-on. The reason I asked that with engagement and with hands-on is there's techniques we use, but I'm not talking about the techniques right now. I'm talking about the outcomes. Like, how should a student walk away from an environmental education program different than they came in? When I say outcomes, like what does success look like? So we've got learning something, so like knowledge change of behavior, making sure it's a positive experience. So there's one, like the kids liked it. That's legit, right? They feel inspired, they feel empowered. Cool. All right, so all of these things I think are captured in what we actually did. Us being nerdy professors, the first thing we did is a massive literature review to figure out, all right, what does the literature say about the outcomes, right? So these terms will be familiar to you, right? So the term environmental literacy originated from the Tbilisi Declaration back in the 1970s, and it's kind of the definition of what most of us think of as environmental education, which is environmental education is education that provides people with the knowledge, skills, dispositions, and attitudes to take on environmental problems together. Okay, so there's elements of knowledge, skills, and attitudes all in that. 21st century skills, there's a whole literature on that. And a lot of those skills really come down to critical thinking and cooperation. How do we work with other people to solve challenging problems? There's a whole huge literature on positive youth development. And a lot of that has to do with students feeling empowered, students feeling a sense of self-efficacy, that like they can do something and that they can make a difference and that they're comfortable in their own skin. So if you're familiar with social emotional learning, a lot of it points there. But so does just like general after school programs. If you look at the literature on camps and after school programs, a lot of them are pointing there. We want kids to understand their identity, feel comfortable in their own skin, and recognize that no matter what comes at them, they have a choice in how they respond and they can influence things. And last, curriculum standards, right? We know that to get into schools and work with schools, oftentimes we have to demonstrate that our work aligns with curriculum standards. So I realize I'm looking to the side. It's because I'm looking at the faces that are on the screen. I'm gonna move that to the center so I'm looking more at you. Okay, so what we did is we were asking that for a while, and then we embarked on a huge participatory process that began in earnest in 2016, where we talked to dozens and dozens of practitioners. We talked to academics. We talked to organizations. So we had NAAEE heavily involved, ANCA, which is the Association of Nature Center Administrators, the National Park Service got involved, all weighing in on this question: what outcomes should every single environmental education program aspire to achieve? From that, we developed some preliminary survey instruments, okay, trying to measure those things. So typically when you measure an outcome that's complex, like environmental literacy, it'll take a lot of survey items to measure that big complex thing. So we did pilot studies in 8 super diverse places all across the United States with hundreds of students in each place. And then we did statistical validation of like all of the measures. So we did that iteratively until we came up with a statistically validated survey instrument that measures all these outcomes that you see here. Byron, I'm going to ask if you can. Byron's going to drop in to the chat a PDF that actually, for each one of these, it will share with you in a table what the actual survey items were measuring each one of these. So I'll let you stare at this for a minute. I'll let you look at that table. There it is. Have a click on that. You can get a sense for, okay, after all that work that took a few years to develop, here's what everyone agreed that, yeah, if you got a really good environmental education program, it should be going for these things. So I might pause there just for a second to see if anyone has questions about how we do it. So if you take one of these items like place connection, you'll see that we had a couple different survey items that measured that. So we're asking students immediately following a program, to what extent did the program change these things for them? Okay, you can come back to that table, download it, print it, whatever you want. It's not like proprietary or anything, just you can use it. All right, so we had a consistent set of outcomes that we turned into a survey that we called EE21, which was short for just environmental education for the 21st century. Like, this is what the field agreed upon are modern day outcomes we should be aiming toward in environmental education. Now, the goal was we could use those surveys to measure the outcomes of these single day field trips for adolescent youth. So when I say adolescent youth, this is like grades 5 to 8. So our sample was single day field trips all across the United States. And here's what we did. We had a team of 4 graduate students, and they traveled the country for about 4 months, about 5 months. And they tracked about 70 characteristics of every program they watched. All right, so they were like, let's say, at Great Smoky Mountains National Park or at a museum or an aquarium. A school group comes in and they observe the entire thing from beginning to end. As soon as the program, and they also took a lot of qualitative notes. So they wrote notes on exactly what they saw. And I can share with you a little bit about how we measured that. I think I took some of the detail out of this presentation, but I'll share with you because it's kind of cool how we did it. So imagine we had an item like, to what extent was this an investigation-focused program? Most programs claim that they were investigation focused. However, what we determined was most of them actually weren't. They were just doing data collection. So everything that we measured, almost everything, we measured on a 1 to 4 scale. So 1 means that characteristic we were looking for was completely absent. And a 4 means that was the central defining quality of that program. So if we take investigation focused, a 4 would be, wow, the whole thing was structured around this massive investigation where they started out with some observation, developed a research question, developed hypotheses from it, tested the hypotheses, analyzed the data, came to conclusions, and then interpreted it and did a so what. If it was like sort of partial, they barely did a little data collection, it would be like a 2 on the scale. If they did almost all of it, it would be a 3 on the scale. So for everything that we measured, we had a 1 to 4 scale systematically. And you can imagine it took a lot of pilot testing with our group to get reliability amongst all the researchers to see these programs in a consistent way. So that took months of observing programs together. Okay, so we observed the programs, we took notes, we scored 70 characteristics of every program, and then we did these surveys with the students immediately following the program. We also did some surveys with teachers and did some other stuff too, but I'm going to focus on the student surveys here. And those surveys measured the outcomes that I shared with you in that table. So we managed to observe over 300 programs provided by 90 organizations across 24 states and the District of Columbia. And so we ended up with over 4,000 post-experience surveys from students measuring those outcomes. Okay, so you following me so far? Anybody have questions? The idea is if we're measuring these consistent outcomes and we've tracked everything that's happened, we can line up. We can say, wow, like every time we see really high outcomes, these 3 or 4 characteristics are almost always there. And maybe there's some characteristics like, wow, every time we see this characteristic, it's always low. Right. So in the end, it's a regression equation. We're putting all these in and seeing which ones predict better outcomes for students. All right. So I'm going to share with you the results of that study, because what I'm going to share with you here is the quantitative big picture study. And then right after that, I'm going to dive into our qualitative work, which I think is a little more nuanced, and it helps us get more to principles. So of all the things that we measured, here are the things that statistically linked most powerfully to better outcomes for students. So there were some elements of the setting. So what does quality staging mean? If you've run environmental education field trips, this will ring true. Like sometimes the bus shows up right on time, everything goes perfectly to plan, the kids are excited, they're smiling, the sun is shining, everything's great. Other times the bus showed up late, Johnny threw up, and 6 students got lost on the way with their parent chaperones, and it's big chaos, right? So what happens right at the very beginning matters. Are we able to set the scene? Are we able to set expectations? Are we able to calmly introduce and get the vibe that we want going? We also saw that there was a correlation between the size of the group and outcomes. So smaller group sizes tended to yield more positive outcomes. People will always ask me, is there an ideal group size? And that we looked and looked and looked in our data. We wanted to see this like inflection point, like, 10 or whatever it might be. The answer is no. It was pretty much linear. The smaller your group tended to have better outcomes, right? There's always ways to buck that trend, but generally kind of makes sense. Like smaller classes tend to do better than large classes as well. Naturalness and novelty are qualities of the setting. That we did see excellent programs that took place in a parking lot or in a basement. However, on average, if you have a choice, our data was telling us, if you have a chance to be in a natural setting, it tended to work better. Novelty has to do with the novelty of a setting. Okay, so you're seeing these pictures here, like these kids who are in that little pond over there or seining on the left-hand side. The setting itself doesn't have to be mind-blowing, mountaintop with, waterfalls coming in from every side. But can we emphasize the novel aspects of setting, right? Can we make it interesting for these kids? These are field trips that we were studying. So if they're coming to a site and they're going to hang out in the classroom while they're at a site, that kind of goes against what kids are expecting in a field trip. So if we have opportunities to choose natural and more novel settings, tended to yield better results. Okay, educator characteristics. So yes, we were actually scoring educators on like what we saw here. So comfort is the extent to which the educator seems comfortable, right? Are they crazy nervous? They struggle answering questions? Now, this doesn't mean that they hadn't answered every question. You can get the high point on the scale by saying, you know what, I don't know the answer to that question. How about when we go back to the nature center, you and I look it up? Or, well, I'm not really sure. What do you think? Let's talk it out. Like comfort, not necessarily proving that you're a walking encyclopedia. Okay? Clarity, how clear was the educator in their instructions to students? Were they using the right language? Or were they talking like scientific jargon? So this was pretty easy for us to measure. We saw a wide range of this. A lot of times instructions weren't clear and students didn't know what they were supposed to be doing. Emotional support. This is the idea that the instructor is being kind and giving high fives and giving positive feedback when students are doing okay. If somebody's struggling, does the instructor like show some compassion? Are they responsive? So this goes hand in hand with responsiveness. Are they responsive not only to students' questions, but also to cues, right? Like it's freezing outside and the students are shivering. Like, can they actually be responsive to what students need? Or they're doing a lecture and it's minute 49 and they're still going and all the students are squirming in their chairs and starting to talk to each other. Do they recognize that they need to move? And the last is more pedagogical things, all right? So this is like program characteristics. So the extent to which the environmental education was place-based. And I'll talk about this a little more when we get into the qualitative study. But it was shocking to us how oftentimes we witnessed an environmental education field trip that really just felt like science class that happened to take place somewhere else, right? Didn't feel special at all. Like we went to one program where the students arrive on a mountaintop and they're overlooking this amazing view and they're like, oh, their minds are blown. And immediately after going to the bathroom, they're taken into a classroom and they spend most of their day there. It's like, why? Like, focus on the place you're in. When students feel grounded in place, it makes it more relevant. They can see what's going on. Verbal engagement, so it's not a one-way communication. The amount of interchange seemed to be positive. Question quality, what does that mean? Well, we all ask questions, right? Like, hey, where are you from? What do you think? Sort of thing. This is really funny. So I teach an undergraduate class in environmental interpretation. I have my students do this for a full week every semester. And I say, write down every question that your professors ask you. And I want you to choose the 3 best ones and 3 worst ones and tell me why they were good or bad. And the same characteristics come up every year. I've been doing it for like a decade. All right. So, well, shoot, you probably know this. What do you think makes a good question? Let's use the chat again. Like, what separates a good question from like either a bad one or kind of just a mundane, useless one? You're dealing with kids. How do you ask good questions? Yeah, open-ended. Thanks, Ellen. Critical thinking. Yes. Makes them think critically. Makes you think. The answer is not too obvious, right? So one of the bad questions are the ones that are really patronizing, right? Like, so everyone look at this tree. What color are the leaves? It's like, oh my God, like it's embarrassing to answer a question like that. Yes, they're green. We can see they're green, right? So they're open-ended and they inspire some sort of thought, or they inspire a student to share their own lived experience or their opinion about something. Okay. Other questions like the gotcha, yes or no, where a student, especially if students are wrong. No, no, no. Oh, you got it. Good. That's what I was looking for, right? So you've all have experience with this. We were tracking this. And the last one here in program characteristics is transitions. And what transitions are, you're probably all familiar with environmental education field trips or any sort of special field day where there's like stations and the students rotate from station to station. Oftentimes, what we were seeing is those stations were completely disconnected from each other, right? Like, oh, we do water quality over here. Oh, and then there's a ropes course. Oh, and then we're going to do soil testing. Okay, have a good day. And the students walk away with no idea as to like, well, okay, we did stuff. I don't know how that fit together. But linking those things together through transitions. Hey, so we just looked at the quality of the water here. When you go up to the next station, I want you to pay attention to what's in the soil. And I want you to answer this question and think about it. How does what's happening up there impact what's down here? Okay, we're going to ask you at the end of the day, right? Like think about the simple ways you can link these things together. This was one of the stronger statistical findings in our work, and we've also seen it in adult education that this actually matters, linking things together in a meaningful way. I'm going to get to more detail on that. So these are the results of the big quantitative study. There's a peer-reviewed publication on this. It's the lead author is Bob Powell, my colleague, and Byron's going to share it with you after the meeting. What I'm really excited to talk about is when we decided to dive in more. So I look at these things and I'm like, okay, this is cool. It's a list of 12 things that if you try and do them, maybe you have a better shot. But we were really interested in getting beyond like do this stuff to like principles. Like what are the principles that really drive better programming? So we decided we were going to dive into that qualitative bit more. So we have a similar sample. And what we decided to do was we were still going to measure outcomes consistently across all the programs we observed. And we'd also do the observation 1 to 4, kind of measurements. But what we really wanted to focus on here is really high quality notes. Okay. So we had our students, we retrained our students and practiced a lot. And oh my God, they were exhausted at the end of this. We had thousands and thousands of pages of qualitative notes. It says 760 pages here for a specific reason. I'll tell you why in a sec. The sample I'm about to share with you, we ended up observing 90 programs like this. It was a lot more work to do this qualitative work. We got surveys at these. The surveys were a bit different. I can go into the story if you're interested, but the short story is this was right after COVID. And when we went back out with our longer surveys, the huge EE21 thing I shared with you, students couldn't do it. Like they had trouble reading and comprehending that. So we shifted to a read aloud survey option with fewer items, which turned out to work pretty dang well. We also did interviews with educators to see what they were trying to get at. But what we did to really get at this is, okay, so see this big box with numbers on the left? Imagine that we had an outcome score for like the environmental literacy thing we were looking for, okay? And it ranged from one is like the program did nothing, it was terrible, to 10, it was great. So imagine that each one of these numbers is the outcome, the average outcome of a program amongst all the students. Now, what happens in this is like there's a lot of noise in these data. So what we decided to do is like we are going to take the top 25%, the absolute best programs, the top 25% of programs, and we're going to compare those qualitatively to the bottom 25%. Because, if you look right at the threshold, is an outcome score of an 8.6 really different than an 8.8? We weren't really sure, but the difference between a 6.7 and an 8.8 probably is, right? So as a team, the entire team, there were 8 of us, we read and reread and reread and reread again those 760 pages for those programs of detailed description of exactly what happened on all of those programs. And our goal was, what do we see consistently in the top that we don't see in the bottom? And what do we consistently see in the bottom that we don't see in the top? This is really going to help us understand what are the necessary conditions for like actually getting there, right? To really separate the best programs from the programs that don't perform very well. So a bit different methods, but I think a bit more convincing in some ways. So I'm jumping straight to it because I don't want to hold you over time or anything. What we found was 6 specific principles that separated the programs in the top quartile from the bottom quartile. So what you're seeing here is 100% of the programs that were in that top 25%, they all had these things. Whereas in the bottom quartile, it was super variable. Some had it, some didn't, but none of them had all of these. Nothing in the bottom had all of these. And you can see here, like almost none of them have this one here, the holistic experience. Okay, so for the rest of the presentation, I want to explain to you what these things are. Because these are the things that we feel, all right, if you're going to develop better programs, these are the things to keep your eye on. Some of them are a little bit obvious, like the first one, meet basic needs, but it's amazing how many times we didn't see that. Okay, here we go. What do we mean by meeting basic needs? Well, most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Like you can't really learn if you're freezing cold or you feel unsafe, right? There's a lot of ways to meet basic needs. So we did see programs where it was like 39 degrees out and kids came in t-shirts and shorts and the instructor had them sitting still on a boat for 40 minutes while they lectured to them on a windy, it's like, oh, of course nothing's going to go well. That's going to end up in our bottom quartile, right? But there were a lot of really cool ways we saw basic needs being met, right? So obviously some of this goes to before you visit or have students visit you. What do they need? Like being really good about that pre-visit communication. And this can have other advantages too. Like, so in some cases we saw on-site educators just zooming into the classroom for like 5 to 10 minutes even. So, you have the stuff that the parents are supposed to read, but they can hit the highlights. What would happen often when we saw that is like when the student showed up and they saw like Jessie, because they saw her face on the screen before, she's like a rock star now because like she was big in the TV in the classroom. And they're like, oh, it's her, look. Right. So like stuff happens to enhance psychological safety as well, just from that little bit of extra work. Obviously, safety and awareness matters, but addressing students' fears, like we saw this brilliantly sometimes, right? So like students were afraid of ticks in one program we saw in Northern California. So the instructor like goes out and they're hiking along a trail, finds a tick, holds it up, and like tells the whole story of like what a tick's trying to do. See it waving there? No, it can't get me because I'm not touching it, right? And here's what happens, and here's how we deal with them, and we're going to look out for each other. What else are you afraid of? Like, and just addressing, like the common stuff that we tell our kids, right? Like the animals are probably more afraid of you than they are of us. Here's what we do if we see one, all that sort of thing. Checking in with students to make sure they're okay, being responsive when they're afraid. Also, like probably the most brilliant thing we saw, and we saw this a bunch, it's more and more common now than it used to be, is having a gear library. So when kids show up to a site, oftentimes it's to the bathroom and then they come together. Some sites will have some kids go to the bathroom, other kids go to the gear library and they get mittens, hats, rain jackets, whatever it is they need. Because we realize not every kid has what they need for these places, right? So this is like an issue of like being more accessible and equitable to all students as well. But it makes sure they have what they need so you don't have to worry about this stuff once you're on site. Okay. Clear instructions. So this one seems pretty obvious. We know this, like if any of you have kids or been a babysitter, or like if kids know what's expected of them, they behave a lot better, right? If they don't know what's expecting, if they do know what's expected of them right up front and they misbehave, you can just remind them, hey, remember those expectations that we have? Like you're outside of one of those. Can you come back in? If we don't make it clear what's expected of kids and they misbehave, then it's panic point and we start yelling. So thinking about this ahead of time. So this can happen ahead of trips with clear pre-trip preparation. It also involves setting clear expectations on site such that kids understand what they're supposed to be doing. It also has to do with pedagogical pieces, right? So I have this picture of these seine nets here. What was really cool in the samples, occasionally we had a program, same site on a different day or a different instructor. And occasionally one ended up in the top quartile and one ended up in the bottom. Same program. There was one case of seine nets where the main difference was the instructor had the students practice with the nets before they actually went out there, like explained it really clearly what they were supposed to do. And it went great. And they collected all sorts of stuff and they felt like they were really good at it. The other one just threw the students out there and they didn't know what to do, right? It became this big mess. So these little subtle things that obviously make sense, forgetting to do them can be a big issue. We also see like just some preparation ahead of time, like occasionally, your kits for testing or whatever the kids are going to do, like making sure they're all complete. If you have some groups that don't have the pH thing, well then they can't do it, right? And you're going to end up with bad outcomes. Explain the purpose of the activity. What are they supposed to learn? We saw cases where they were doing pH testing of water, and the instructor's like, all right, you're going to do pH testing. And what you're looking for is a 7.2. That's the thing you're looking for. Okay, now we're going to do the Secchi disc and just like moving from activity to activity without the education around it, right? Instead of saying like, hey, what does pH mean? Okay, well, right, it's the level of acidity or basicness of the water. Like, why do we care about it? So an alternative program would be like, okay, different pHs benefit or disadvantage different organisms. Let's measure the pH. Who might this be good for, right? Like which organisms? Let's pick them out. Now let's go see if that's true. Let's see if they're there, right? So giving students a purpose, which seems obvious, but oftentimes we saw instructors just going through the motions of the activity without the purpose behind it or the learning objective behind it. Managing attention. Okay. So we have to think kids' attention spans are pretty small. I mean, adults' attention spans are pretty small now these days too. Um, when we would see a lecture going on with kids sitting still, once we hit around the 20-minute mark, it was pretty much over. All right. So that means variety is really important. It also means that even something that's going really well, if you do it for too long, it's not going to work great. We had one program that was it was actually the instructor was amazing, right? It was a forest walk and they were using claim evidence reasoning for whatever the kids noticed. Like, oh, it's a big nest, and they're going to describe it. And the kids loved it. They did it for about 2 to 2.5 hours before lunchtime, and it was great. And then after lunch, they went back and did the same exact thing for another 2 hours. And within a half an hour of that, the kids were done, completely lost. And it ended up being one of the lowest scoring things, even though the instructor was excellent. Like kids need a bit of variety. we need to plan for unplanned free time. Like this happens all the time. Sometimes it's planned. So how many of you maybe use like Project Wet, Project Learning Tree, Project Wild, right? A lot of that game sort of stuff or group stuff. Like what happens when a kid gets out in the game or a group finishes early? Yeah, you need to have a plan for that, right? Because the kids are standing around, that's trouble. And a lot of times it's unplanned. So three groups are hiking, they're supposed to end up in one point, and one group gets there earlier and they're waiting around, or they're waiting for a bus to come and get them. What do you do in that unplanned free time? So we saw like genius stuff. Like one instructor was a geology themed tour. She's like waiting around. It's like, all right, everyone go find the coolest rock you can find. You have 10 minutes. Go find the coolest dang rock and bring it back. All right, now we're going to talk about each one of these rocks. What's cool about it? Oh, striations. What do you think that means? Right? We can fill those times, but plan ahead for how am I going to fill those times when I'm stuck with them? Because it happens all the time, right? So keeping kids' attention. Positive emotional support. This is a picture of a residential environmental education center we work with a lot. When the kids get off the bus, talk about staging, there's music playing and everyone's there clapping and cheering as they come in. Like it's a great example of like setting a tone. Emotional support involves demonstrating caring for the kids. And I'll have to say, like, we did see the opposite of this a number of times. Like, we had one educator saying really loud to us as the researchers, "Man, I hate these kids." It's like, oh my God, that's probably not a great thing to be saying in front of the kids. But being positive, being caring, encouraging participation, trying to be equitable about participation, responding to students. Instead of ignoring a question you can't answer, taking that approach, like, you know what, that's a great question. Let's talk about it. Don't know. This last bullet's kind of cool. And we saw some interesting stuff with labeling of children. So a lot of programs will do, okay, kids, today we're going to be scientists. And as cheesy as that might sound, or today we're going to be adventurers or whatever it is, like we found that often to have a positive impact if the educator then explained what they meant. So if we're going to be scientists, like how do scientists learn? Well, actually, primarily they learn by proving themselves wrong, right? Science, we reject hypotheses. We never prove anything. So failure is okay. Finding the unexpected is when great stuff happens. And that's how we learn. We try new things and we learn, right? So that you can set the tone so that a kid's not afraid to make mistakes, right? We can do that in lots of different ways. We have this little bullet down here, this question, because I think a lot of us assume that our educators, like the staff we hire, seasonals, or like the undergraduate intern you've got, or high school person, like already understands how to do this. Don't assume that your staff know how to do this. Like this takes a little bit of practice and some focus to know, like, oh, I actually need to do this. Like being positive with my kids is really important. So in the classes that I teach here with undergrads, I tell my students, like, hey, if you're having a crappy day, but you still got to teach kids or you got to go do a presentation, sorry, like act, okay? Like you need to put on the persona that's going to be the best version of you for this experience. And that's going to make a difference for the student's outcome. So a lot of what we found in this research, you can see in the quantitative and here, if you read the NAAA guidelines or a lot of best practice stuff, most of it's about the pedagogy, like, oh, do inquiry based, do this or that. A lot of what we're finding is about like the relationship between the educator and the students. So that's like kind of novel and nuanced about our findings, and this stuff came out pretty strongly. Okay, a focus on novelty. So I mentioned this in the quantitative results. Here, this came out very powerfully in our qualitative results. So I love this picture here down at the bottom because just because you're not in some amazing mountaintop place doesn't mean you can't make it novel, right? Can you have students take off their shoes and feel the grass under their feet and walk around and then maybe look for tracks or something like that? Can you have them get down and watch the ants and ask a million questions about it? Can you hold up a leaf and just be like, hey, what do you see there? Or a piece of grass? Like, you know what? The light comes through. Why do you think that is? Oh, there's parts of it are hollow. What do you think that is? Whoa, what's happening in the hollow space? Like, I mean, there's a million ways to make boring stuff novel. If we focus on the novel aspects, or we choose the more novel components of our environment, Like if you have a choice between a parking lot and somewhere that's super cool, choose the cool place. It actually seems to make a difference. But if you don't have a cool place, make it novel, like make something interesting. The programs that ended up in the bottom often did feel like that classroom experience. Okay, kids, here's your ditto. You're going to follow along with me and fill it out. Follow step one, look through the microscope. The answer is 7, right? Like it's not going to get these kids to any of the outcomes we care about. Okay, this is the last principle. This is the 6th one. And this one, if you remember that initial table I showed you, this is the one that came up most powerfully. And it's really fascinating. So if you think of a field trip and a kid comes home and their parents ask them, hey, what'd you do today? Most kids can answer, oh, well, we like mucked around on the coastline, then we looked at rocks and filled out some sheets. Not hard to answer that question. Okay. If a parent answers, hey, what was the point of your field trip? How many kids can answer that? That's where this principle comes in. Okay, so there needs to be some connection between all the elements of what it is you're trying to do here. So if we think about this in kind of a logical way, sorry, I just lost a screen here. Come back to the idea of stations, okay? Those transitions are something that actually make it holistic if you can tie the pieces together. So imagine a program that's doing water quality testing, maybe something like soil coring and a high ropes adventure course. Like what's a kid supposed to take away from that? Right? Can we connect the pieces through logical sequencing, transitions, and like linking back and forth to enable a kid to answer that question? Hey, what was the point? So the way that in the field of interpretation does this is through the idea of a theme. So what a theme is a complete sentence that reveals a central meaning, like what were kids supposed to walk away understanding? So it can't be a topic like bats. They were supposed to understand bats. No, it should be like, well, what about bats mattered? Like, what's the actual thing they're supposed to take away? So on the next slide, I put some examples of themes. And the first one will be the example of the question I just laid out to you all. You have water quality, soils, and high ropes adventure. How can you tie it together? All right, so imagine you tied it together with this first theme. Healthy communities, whether they're made up of people or ecosystems, rely on healthy interactions between their components. True in water systems, true in the soil community, true in the human community, right? On high ropes. So I did it backwards, right? Okay, I have these things and I made a theme out of it. The way to do this, right, is to start with the theme, right? This is like good teachers start with learning objectives and go backwards. If our outcomes aren't necessarily, they usually aren't. Okay, environmental education, yes, we want students to learn facts, right? But that's not the core of what we're doing. We want to do this environmental literacy stuff. We want to give them skills. We want to empower them. We want to make them connected with their environment and their place and their communities, right? We want to do way more than learning facts. We need to develop learning objectives or theme statements that actually get us to those types of outcomes. And the stuff you do along the way that links to SOLs, that's the easy part, right? We all know how to drop a Secchi disk, okay? So here's some examples of themes that we've seen in environmental education programs that have worked quite well. So the second one is a theme of self-efficacy, right? Empowering kids to recognize that the choices they make actually make a difference on their environments. Or if it's a science-based program, like, hey, science helps us understand what's going on here. It can also help us protect it, right? You can imagine activities that you could build around a theme like that. Whatever happens upstream can have profound effects on downstream, right? Like you can imagine a really cool program at a site that like really helps students understand that, such that when they come out, they understand why they did that. Oh, the big point of this was this. So I hope that makes sense. Okay, so I'm going to sum up so we can chat. Okay, so here are, when you take the quantitative and the qualitative and overlay them, these are the principles that come up. These are the things that separate the programs that do this amazing stuff for kids from the programs that just don't do this amazing stuff for kids. And we have empirical statistical evidence for all of these particular practices. I'll leave this up just for a sec. And there's another peer-reviewed paper that Byron has that she'll share with you all that has all the detailed results behind this and how we measured everything. With that, I think I'm going to open it up to questions and discussion. Oh, and there's my email at the bottom of this screen. But I think oh, and if you'd like to take a screenshot, like there's a ton of publications that have come out of this. You can screenshot this and go find some of these publications if you want. I'll give you a minute to do that, and then we'll just go back to those 7 principles and have a chat. Okay. Okay. So yes, I guess I'll leave this on the screen, or we can stop screen sharing and we can just talk for a little bit. Thanks for hanging with me for all that time.
You've got one question in the chat right now about the study, if there was any study of the length of each program segment.
We weren't able to do that because of the variability within programs. Like that unit, we couldn't get an outcome for each unit. Qualitatively, I think I mentioned like lecturing for 20 minutes or more seemed problematic. So there's that. Otherwise, it just seemed like certain things could work really well for quite a while. But there is, I guess I would say what we learned is being responsive when it's pretty clear the students are done, figuring out how to wrap that thing up and move on, rather than sticking to a preordained schedule. Another thing that we noticed, and I haven't mentioned this yet, but it did come out in our quantitative stuff, is that part of that holistic experience is concluding well, like having a meaningful conclusion that helps kids understand the point, right? Reflecting and even telling them, like, here's the thing we hoped you learned, okay? They'll go away knowing it better. And what we find is a lot of times when groups are in a hurry, like the bus showed up late or something like that, they stick to the program and often miss the conclusion. Our research suggests it's better to skip a part of the program so that you can, or speed up a part of the program so that you still have the conclusion. Like skipping the conclusion, the take home message, is more impactful than skipping one piece of what you had planned to do, typically. Any suggestions for groups with varying ages? Whew, that's a great question. It's a much longer discussion, I think. One of the things that we found in the quantitative sample is that programs for 5th and 6th graders performed better than programs for 7th and 8th graders. We think the reason is, this is qualitative and anecdotal, but we've seen this in other studies too. Most of the organizations we were working with primarily worked with 5th and 6th graders, and they didn't adapt their programs to 7th and 8th graders. So the 7th and 8th graders were getting programs for 5th and 6th graders, basically. So there is a difference. We didn't have a big enough sample of the 7th and 8th graders to break it out and then do it that way. So I wish we did, but nothing clear except I'd say probably really try to avoid being patronizing to 7th and 8th graders. Okay. Yeah, so many do seem to have that. And it's not that the stations, it can't be successful. It's just they tend not to be successful unless they're linked together into a cohesive learning objective. So when we sometimes we do this presentation in person, and I think some of you may even be that we start out by describing a program that's stations and the kids are loving it, they're high-fiving, they're having a lot of fun. And then we reveal, yeah, that was like the lowest scoring program in our entire sample because they didn't learn anything. They liked it, but like all the other stuff we measure outside of enjoyment came out low, right? So we have to think about what are we really going for. So yeah, thanks for that observation. It is really common to have those stations. What else? I can share with you one of the ways we were able to slice these data was by the demographics of students. What we found was we did this really cool study, and it's on that, it's one of the papers that have Thorpe as the lead author, that's one of my master's students. We looked at where the student school, their home school was, and the voting records of that place to determine the socio-political context of that environment, and also just the socio-demographic characteristics like free and reduced lunch, socioeconomic status. And what we found was environmental education field trips can be impactful for anybody. They tend to have a bigger impact for students who come from more conservative or more Republican voting areas and from lower socioeconomic status than for liberal, like Democratic voting areas and higher wealth areas. So fascinating, right? So we found like, wow, if there's an audience that's being underserved and can have a big bang for the buck, it might be conservative areas that we want to really be hitting. Was there a difference in results based on the age of the educator? Thankfully, no. Anyone can be good at any age if they do this stuff, right? For programs when environmental educators visit a classroom, do you have advice for bringing the nature novelty component inside? Yeah, so we didn't study that, but I think within this group, you'd probably get a lot of amazing ideas, like wildlife, bringing an animal works. Getting out into the schoolyard and looking at it in a new way. So props can help. Even really amazing visuals, like we've seen some other studies where like, yeah, it's a PowerPoint, but oh my God, that stuff was wicked cool, right? So like, there's ways to make things not feel like it feels in their mundane day-to-day, classwork. So anything that brings us out of that routine, I think can really help. How applicable these findings are for adult education. Oh my gosh. So if you'd like to talk about adult education, that's like a completely different study that we've done as well that has similar methods to this. So we did a study back in 2012 of about 300 interpretive programs in national parks. And then we redid that study again, and we're about to publish the findings over 400 programs for adults in national parks over the last year and a half. And some of it overlaps, particularly if we're looking at these principles, the ones that would overlap powerfully are going to be 4, 5, and 6. Building a positive relationship with your audience. A lot of times we ignore that with adults. We assume, oh, they're here, so all right, we're good. But actually, like spending the time to like build positive relationships makes a difference. The holistic experience is a really powerful one. So that idea of having a theme and having this be cohesive and having a meaningful so what matters a whole lot. I've been to I don't know if you're thinking about like extension type programs or what types of programs, but a lot of times it's focused on the activity, or we're here to make rain barrels, we're going to do it. We can really enhance that with some storytelling and some bigger picture thing in your presentation. Other than, all right, first thing you're going to do is you're going to cut the screen, and this next thing, right? Like, so just thinking about like, what would I really want people to come away with from this? Like, how can I do that in a way that's meaningful to them? And how can I build a relationship with them and maybe between them that's going to make them feel really good when they come out? So if you're interested, I can come back and present on that study. but it is a bit different. Like it's like a Venn diagram. It's overlapping, but there's some different stuff. Oh, and the novelty, I said 4, 5, and 6. There's this concept and interpretation, for those of you familiar with that field, of provocation. It's the idea of asking people, not necessarily asking, but purposefully provoking your audience to consider something novel, like something not routine, something out of the ordinary. And there's a lot of ways interpreters do that. But we found in that sample, like that was pretty critical to ending up in the top, is having something that provoked the audience to have to consider something that they wouldn't have normally considered. Questions we're looking at next in this realm. Well, with students right now, we're working with that North Bay Education Group, which is on the Chesapeake Bay, just in Maryland. We're looking at identity development and how that happens in environmental education. We're looking at the role that adventure components play in environmental education. And we're also really interested in how experiences like this can influence classroom climate. Because there's not a lot of evidence for that. We assume that, like, oh, one of the things these can do is they can make students feel more comfortable with each other and their teacher. So we're going to be looking for evidence. Like, do they actually do that? I mean, maybe, and how, if they do. Like, what are the ways that you can do that so that, like, when you leave or when the students leave your site, maybe the classroom is a little more vibrant or more friendly or more open. So within this realm, that's what we're doing. The other related research really is with adults in national park settings. And so you can keep an eye out for that. And as I mentioned, yeah, I mean, if it's relevant to this crew, I can certainly share the findings with y'all at some point. We should have them finalized within a couple months.
I will definitely be in touch about that.
Okay. Maybe I'll stop sharing so I can see more of you. Well, if anyone has anything any other questions you think of, we might have some data to speak to it. Um, I'm happy to answer emails or anything like that. Okay, so there's a couple more have popped up here. How can we help teachers feel more comfortable taking students on field trips? Oh, that's another area of research that we've worked on. And it's really insightful that you ask it that way, because we actually have done a couple studies where we're looking at what are the barriers, constraints, and motivations for teachers coming on field trips. And oftentimes we assume that the barriers and constraints are administrative, like, oh, they don't have money for the buses or things like that. Oftentimes that's not the thing. If a teacher really wants to come, we, in our experience, like pretty much everywhere we've seen other people do this work and we've done this work, they can make it happen. What we found is key is I'd have to look back at this paper, but here's what I remember, because it was a few years ago we did this last. One, that students believe it will be fun for them. Like that teachers actually think they'll have a good time. Two, that they think it will complement their coursework. And three, that it's going to be easy. So, and there's some other things around the edges, but like really like reaching out to teachers to convince them of those things and to help them, like they're going to have ideas for how you can make it fun for them, and to consider those ideas as legitimate. Like the teacher matters as much as the students. If you don't have them, it's just not going to work. We've also done research, a lot of environmental education programs, when they bring students and their teachers on site, it varies how engaged the teacher is on site. From like, oh, it's a vacation for the teacher, they sit back and do nothing, to like, no, they're shoulder to shoulder with you doing the thing, right? We did research at one place where it was a choice for teachers. So we were able to study in the same place the difference that it made. And we found when teachers were engaged on site, students had more positive learning outcomes. So that place no longer makes it an option for teachers to take a vacation. They have to do stuff on site. But thinking carefully about, like, what should they do? Should it be a huge burden on them? No. So the way this group does it is, like, when they arrive, the students go off and do some stuff, and they do some quick stuff with the teacher to like get them on board with what they're doing. And then they're there with them, kind of shoulder to shoulder and helping. So it's not like some crazy heavy lift for the teachers. So that's a really great question. But yeah, the teachers matter more than I think we often think. Like, we might go to superintendents or administrators first. If you get a champion teacher, it's going to work way better in our experience. All right, is it good to have teams within a group? Whew. I'd say that depends. To divide huge group into smaller groups, yes. To make competition out of it, it depends in this way. So gamification, like making things a game, can be really, really powerful for a lot of students, unless it gets too competitive, right? We've seen that happen too. So it's a bit of a risk. I think if there's a way to do the gamification in a way that doesn't feel like there's clear losers, yes. um, Otherwise, I mean, it might still work really well, but it can be really risky if they're competing against each other. All right. Well, if you have other questions, feel free to shoot me an email. Thanks for all the work that you all do. You guys are heroes out there. I just get to like study what you do. So I get in some ways my work's a lot easier.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stern. Thank you all so much for joining. And I'll make sure that I send out some of those papers and things that Dr. Stern mentioned during the presentation, as well as the recording to this training itself. But thank you so much, everyone, for joining. And thank you for coming, Dr. Stern.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. Good luck, everybody.